welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into, well, a conflict that's been simmering, sometimes boiling over, for more than 40 years. It's never been officially declared, but it constantly threatens to ignite something much bigger across the Middle East.
Yeah, it's often called a shadow war, a war that dares not speak its name.
Exactly. And our mission today is to try and untangle some of these complex threads. We're talking mainly about the confrontation between Iran on one side and the United States and Israel on the other.
Right. We want to take you through the key moments, the surprising turns, the flashpoints that have really shaped this ongoing rivalry. The goal is to help you get quickly up to speed on a conflict that, honestly, could reshape the entire region.
And let's start with something that might genuinely surprise you. I mean, today it's almost impossible to picture, but before 1979, Iran was arguably Israel's most important partner after the U.S.
It's wild to think about now, isn't it?
It really is. Relations were excellent. You had lots of Israelis living there, working on huge economic projects. Israel, pretty isolated in the Arab world back then, saw this pro-Western, non-Arab Iran as a natural ally.
And they weren't just like friendly neighbors, they collaborated closely, even on really sensitive military stuff, missiles, for instance.
Yeah, the U.S. They saw Iran as the absolute cornerstone of their influence in the region, a bulwark against the Soviets. Huge military cooperation there, too.
It's just such a stark contrast to the reality we see today.
Absolutely. And that massive shift, that unraveling, really kicks off February 1st, 1979.
That's the day Ayatollah Khamenei returns to Tehran. He'd been in exile for 15 years, but he'd always embodied this deep opposition to the Shah. His return signaled a radical change was coming.
So, Khamenei returns. What were the forces, the underlying reasons that allowed this revolution to gain so much momentum and just sweep away the old order?
Well, at its heart, the Shah's regime was seen by many Iranians as basically a military dictatorship. It was perceived as corrupt, offering little equal opportunity.
And he was pushing this Western-style modernity pretty hard, wasn't he?
Willingly or by force, as some sources put it. But it often failed to meet people's basic needs, creating a lot of resentment.
And layered on top of those internal issues, there was this powerful anti-imperialist sentiment brewing.
Definitely. And the U.S. and Israel, because they were such strong backers of the Shah, they became the symbols of that imperialism.
You had anti-American slogans, often driven by like a leftist view that saw imperialism as the root of all problems.
Right. And then religious forces saw the U.S. as this beacon of modernity that they fundamentally rejected. And there was this persistent belief, whether true or not, that the Shah's secret police, SAVAK,
was basically run by the Israeli Mossad.
That was the perception inside Iran, yeah. And so in the eyes of the revolutionaries, that implicated Israelis directly in the killing, tortures, managing, organizing of SAVAK's operations.
What's really striking looking back is how unprepared, how almost blind both the U.S. and Israel seem to be.
It seems that way. Their contacts were mostly with the elites, the higher class people or military people who had a vested interest in things staying the same.
So they weren't getting the bad news, or maybe weren't hearing it?
Probably a bit of both. They just fundamentally underestimated the strength, the depth of the popular uprising that was building.
And this blindness, this underestimation, it contributed to tragedy, didn't it? Black Friday.
Yeah. The Shah's army opens fire on protesters in Tehran. The official death toll was, 87?
But the opposition claimed thousands. Maybe up to 4,000.
A huge discrepancy. But what it did was reveal the monarchy's true face as people saw it. It convinced many observers inside and outside Iran that the Shah just couldn't win anymore. The revolution felt irreversible after that.
So chaos erupts. And American and Israeli expats become targets.
Immediately. Symbols of the West, cafes, cinemas, banks, they were attacked. They were associated with the Shah, with the U.S., with Israel.
In the Israeli diplomatic mission in Tehran.
It was sacked. Completely devastated. The last 33 Israelis had to make this incredibly tense escape. A 17-kilometer journey to the airport through streets just teeming with revolutionaries.
Like a hotbed of revolution, trying to get out while maybe 10 million Iranians were on the roads. Could you even imagine?
It sounds terrifying. The description of the bus, the guards with Kalashnikovs, the final check on the plane. Pure tension.
And as they're making this desperate escape, a political vacuum is opening up and someone steps right into it.
Precisely. And this is where things get really interesting, geopolitically speaking. Literally hours after the last Israeli plane takes off.
Yasser Arafat arrives.
The leader of the PLO.
Yeah.
And he's welcomed like a head of state. Khomeini sends this powerful message out to the Muslim world. Iran now supports the Palestinian cause. He frames it as this existential fight Islam versus the Christian imperialist West.
And the symbolism. It couldn't have been clearer.
Spectacularly clear. The sacked Israeli diplomatic mission immediately becomes the Palestinian embassy, a huge symbolic shift.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Then comes the event that really cements this new reality, this great clash, November 4th, 1979.
The U.S. embassy invasion. Hundreds of Islamist students take 52 American diplomats hostage, and they hold them for
444 days. An eternity.
Khomeini, maybe initially hesitant, ends up backing the students, helps them consolidate power, rally support against the great Satan.
And for the U.S., it just crystallizes this view that Washington was completely unprepared to deal with the nature of Iran at that point. The anger, the revolutionary fervor, it was a shock.
A massive shock, and it seals the rift. No going back, really.
So this new conflict dynamic, it finds a new and incredibly tragic battleground pretty quickly, doesn't it?
Lebanon.
Yeah.
June 6, 1982, Israel invades Lebanon, Operation Peace for Galilee. Around 90,000 troops, tanks, the works.
Led by Ariel Sharon, who was defense minister then. The stated goal was just to push the PLO back 40 kilometers from the border, stop the rocket attacks.
Right, that was the initial objective. But Sharon, well, he exceeded that mandate pretty quickly. The Israeli forces advanced rapidly, heading straight for Beirut.
Meanwhile, Iran's in the middle of its own brutal war.
The Iran-Iraq War. Absolutely devastating, lasted 8 years, maybe 500,000 dead. Khomeini just didn't have the capacity to open up a second major front against Israel in Lebanon at that time.
So he makes that statement.
The road to Jerusalem goes through Karbala, which our sources describe as, a religious way of expressing a deeply strategic decision, basically. Deal with Saddam Hussein first. Karbala being a hugely symbolic Shiite site in Iraq.
So Arafat's PLO is defeated in Lebanon, forced out. But the Israeli invasion has this unintended consequence.
It politicizes Lebanon's largest community, the Shiites. They were suffering directly under the Israeli invasion and occupation, and many decided they had to resist.
And they looked to Iran.
Their leaders sought Khomeini's blessing, yeah. His revolutionary ideology resonated deeply with their own beliefs and their situation. So in the summer of '82, in Baalbek, in the Bekaa Valley,
that's where Hezbollah starts.
The Islamic resistance in Lebanon is formed. It takes the name Hezbollah officially 3 years later, 1985. Initially, its goals were military and pretty secret.
And Iran's role was more than just ideological inspiration.
Oh, much more. They sent advisors, a few hundred revolutionary guards, the Pasdaran, to the Bekaa. They provided weapons, money, and know-how. They had these old and deep ties with Lebanese Shiites they could leverage.
So if we zoom out, this is the birth of that critical strategic alliance.
The Iran-Syria-Hezbollah axis, absolutely. What starts in the Bekaa Valley becomes this veritable system of alliances.
Designed to give Iran reach, right? Tools to threaten Israel and also the U.S. presence in Lebanon.
Strategic depth, exactly. A proxy right on Israel's northern border.
And this new axis, it introduces a terrifying new element to the conflict.
Martyrdom operations, suicide attacks. November 11th, 1982. Ahmad Qasir, just 18 years old, a Hezbollah fighter, drives a car bomb into the Israeli military HQ in Tyre.
Demolishes a 7-story building.
Completely. It was rooted in Shiite history, the cult of martyrs, Imam Hussein at Karbala. But in a modern context, it was a bold act that had no precedent. A new form of struggle previously unheard of.
The casualties were staggering.
91 Israeli soldiers killed, plus 15 Lebanese prisoners held there. A massive blow.
And what's truly mind-boggling is the Israeli intelligence failure surrounding this.
Astounding, yeah. The official Israeli inquiry concluded it was a gas pipe explosion.
A gas leak. Seriously.
That was the official finding. And apparently it was never officially questioned. One former intel officer later said he found almost nothing, zero paperwork on Lebanese Shiites in their files at the time.
It just shows how unprepared they were for this new kind of enemy, this new tactic.
Completely unprepared, which raises the question, if they were so blind, what happens next?
Almost exactly a year later, October 23rd, 1983.
Another attack of unprecedented violence, this time against the multinational force in Beirut. A huge truck bomb hits the U.S. Marine barracks, kills 241 Marines.
And simultaneously, another attack hits the French contingent.
58 French soldiers killed. These were claimed by a group nobody had really heard of, the mysterious Islamic Jihad movement.
But widely believed to be.
Almost certainly a figurehead for Hezbollah and Iran. The tactics, the scale, it pointed straight back to them.
So, after these attacks, the international forces eventually pull out. And the Israelis.
They become increasingly bogged down. It's costly, unpopular back home. So on June 6, 1985, 3 years after the invasion, Israel withdraws from most of Lebanon. They keep a security zone in the south, but
It is seen as a defeat.
a severe, even humiliating defeat for Israel, and conversely, a first victory for Hezbollah. They actually chose that moment, the withdrawal, to claim responsibility for the tire bombing 2 years earlier and reveal Ahmad Qasir's name. November 11th becomes their Martyrs' Day.
And Hezbollah wasn't just fighting, they were building a base.
Right, absolutely. Creating what's called a counter-society. Building support from the ground up, nurseries, schools, scout movements, winning hearts and minds while resisting the occupation.
So by the time Khomeini dies in June 1989,
His strategy of confronting Israel in the U.S., primarily through Hezbollah in Lebanon, had fundamentally changed the landscape in the Middle East. It was a whole new ballgame.
after Khomeini, Iran gets new leadership.
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei becomes the supreme leader, which he still is today, and Hashemi Rafsanjani was president. Rafsanjani was known more as a pragmatist. He was focused on rebuilding Iran after that devastating war with Iraq.
Which brings us to 1991, the first Gulf War. And this seems like another one of those moments, a potential missed opportunity.
It really does. President George H.W. Bush, after liberating Kuwait from Saddam Hussein, he has this vision for a new Middle East. The centerpiece is the Madrid Peace Conference, aimed at Arab-Israeli reconciliation.
Now here's the fascinating part. Iran, despite all the death to America rhetoric and the deep hostility, they actually helped the U.S. coalition.
Quietly, yes. They quietly supported the United States against Saddam, who was, after all, their recent enemy. They even let U.S. planes use Iranian airspace, apparently.
And Rafsanjani saw an opening.
He did. He began talking about normalizing relations even with the United States. He was hoping Iran could be included and its isolation. Remember, the Islamic Republic was basically bankrupt and devastated after the war.
But the invitation to Madrid never came.
Explicitly excluded. The reason seemed to be partly the hangover from the hostage-taking, that resentment lingered in Washington, and also just the perception that Iran was implacably opposed to the very idea of peace talks anyway.
And Iran's interpretation of this snub.
Pretty sharp, according to our sources. If they're not problematic enough, they will be ignored. Basically, being pragmatic didn't get them a seat at the table.
So instead of joining the U.S.-led process, Iran launches its own countermove.
Exactly. 2 weeks before Madrid even starts, Iran organizes its own conference in Tehran focused on supporting Palestine. They gather representatives from about 60 different movements, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which were becoming more prominent.
And this builds new connections.
Forges close links. This is really the foundation of what Tehran would later explicitly call the axis of resistance. Their beliefs solidified. The liberation of Palestine could only be achieved through resistance. Negotiations, compromises, they wouldn't work.
And then the cycle of violence escalates again. February 1992.
Israel assassinates Hezbollah's Secretary General Abbas Musawi in a helicopter attack in southern Lebanon. From a pure intelligence standpoint, finding and hitting him was an unquestionable success.
But strategically,
Maybe a disaster. An Israeli official quoted in the sources basically says, "No one considered the consequences of the action."
and the consequences weren't long in coming.
Just a month later, March 17th, a massive car bomb destroys the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Kills 28 people.
Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility again.
Yes, but many in Israel and elsewhere saw it as a direct response from Hezbollah and Tehran for Musawi's killing. As one Israeli official later reflected, questioning the wisdom of the assassination, perhaps the Shia devil had become even more fearsome. Did the action just provoke an even worse reaction?
And around the same time, Israel picks up on something even more alarming.
Iran's nuclear program. Israel was apparently the first in the 1990s to pick up on it, realizing Iran was planning to develop nuclear weapons. It took U.S. intelligence a couple more years to reach the same conclusion.
For Israel, obviously, that's an existential threat.
Absolutely changes the entire calculation.
So, facing this escalating proxy war with Hezbollah and the looming nuclear threat, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin tries a different approach in 1993.
The Oslo Accords. That famous handshake with Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn, a historic and enduring image.
Now, part of Rabin's thinking, according to some analyses, was related to Iran.
Yes. The idea was that making peace with the Palestinians would help Israel better protect itself from Iran. If you could reduce the temperature on the Palestinian front, maybe isolate Iran more, you'd be in better position to deal with the nuclear threat and Hezbollah.
But Iran, predictably perhaps, wasn't on board with Oslo?
Not at all. They'd never been in the favor of peace process. They saw it as a plot, basically, a way to sideline Palestinian rights and dreams.
So their response to Oslo
Was to double down on supporting the groups opposed to Oslo, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. They stepped up financial, political, and social support, even supplying the ammunition used in attacks. There were reports of promises of cash bounties for killing Israelis.
So Oslo, instead of isolating Iran, maybe just intensified Iran's efforts through its proxies.
You could certainly argue that. It hardened the lines.
Okay, let's jump forward to the turn of the millennium. A truly world-changing event, 9/11.
September 2001. The attacks on the U.S. blamed on al-Qaeda. President George W. Bush launches the War on Terror. It was a massive wake-up call, a great trauma for America, leading to a much more interventionist foreign policy.
Now, here we go again with another strange twist to this relationship. The U.S. targets the Taliban in Afghanistan and finds itself working with Iran.
It sounds bizarre, but yes, it was a classic case of coincidence of interest.
Iran hated the Taliban.
Totally. The Taliban were Sunni extremists who had persecuted Afghanistan's Shia minority. They'd even attacked the Iranian consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif in 1998 and killed Iranian diplomats. So there was deep animosity and enmity.
So when the U.S. went after the Taliban,
Iran saw an opportunity to get rid of a dangerous neighbor. They provided Revolutionary Guard support to the Northern Alliance, the Afghan groups fighting the Taliban on the ground, who the U.S. was also backing. So indirectly, they were helping the U.S. effort.
this cooperation, even if indirect, seems like it could have been another opening for dialogue, especially at the Bonn Conference in December 2001, setting up the post-Taliban government in Afghanistan.
It seemed that way. The Iranian delegate, Mohammad Zarif, who later became foreign minister, played a really central role. He apparently surprised U.S. officials by suggesting language about democracy or free elections and cooperation against international terrorism for the final declaration.
Iran must have been feeling pretty good about that.
They were reportedly jubilant. They felt they'd shown they could be a stabilizing role in the region, and they were hoping this might lead to an end to sanctions, maybe some normalization.
But in Washington, especially in the post-9/11 atmosphere,
the neoconservatives were very influential. People like Vice President Dick Cheney, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, they viewed Iran's cooperation in Afghanistan as purely tactical and thus temporary.
not a sign of genuine change.
No, they rejected any idea of a broader dialogue. The decision was almost made by default, as one official put it, because, as Cheney famously said,
We don't talk to evil.
that was the mindset. It highlights this recurring tension in U.S. policy, the moralistic framing versus pragmatic engagement.
And that door slammed shut definitively in early 2002.
Bush's State of the Union address, the infamous Axis of Evil speech, he lumps Iran together with North Korea and Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
It signaled a new, much tougher U.S. policy.
Absolutely. Removing regimes that didn't align with U.S. interests, by force if necessary. Some even controversially suggested the goal was to create chaos all around Israel as a way of enhancing Israeli security, though that's a fringe view.
Then comes the Iraq invasion in 2003. The U.S. takes down Saddam Hussein based on claims about WMDs and al-Qaeda links that later turned out to be false. How did Iran react to seeing U.S. troops right next door?
With deep concern. Intense fear, actually. They saw the U.S. military machine roll through Iraq and thought, are we next? They genuinely believed the U.S. might try to destabilize Iran or invade the country.
So they started preparing for a potential conflict.
Yes, their whole strategic posture shifted towards defense, towards anticipating some kind of American attack.
Okay, so Iran's feeling incredibly vulnerable. U.S. troops are in Afghanistan on one side, Iraq on the other. What do?
Something pretty remarkable, actually. Just 3 days after the U.S. declared victory in Iraq, Tehran sends a secret proposal to Washington.
Through the Swiss embassy, right. This becomes known as the Grand Bargain Offer.
Exactly. It was incredibly comprehensive. They proposed talks on basically everything that divided them from the U.S., their links with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the disarmament of Hezbollah, even their own WMD programs, including the nuclear issue.
Wow, that's putting almost everything on the table. What did they want in return?
Lifting of sanctions, crucially. Recognition of Iran's legitimate security interests and its regional role, and access to Western civilian nuclear technology.
What was the thinking behind such a sweeping offer at that moment?
Sources suggest there was a faction in Iran, perhaps around Rafsanjani and future President Rouhani, who believed the only way to break the deadlock was to do something big. a bold gesture to force the U.S. to engage seriously.
And the U.S. response?
Skepticism, mainly. The State Department, particularly the Cheney Rumsfeld camp, basically dismissed it. This was the peak of American hubris, as some called it. They'd just won 2 quick wars.
They thought they had all the cards.
They believed U.S. leverage was only increasing, so there was no hurry to talk to Iran on Iran's terms.
So another rejection, after Madrid, after Bonn.
This rejection, combined with the Axis of Evil label, really solidified the hardliners' view in Tehran. Washington was still bent on effecting a change of regime, no matter what Iran offered.
And the consequence of that conclusion?
Ayatollah Khamenei reportedly made a radical decision: intensify and press ahead with the uranium enrichment program, and in doing so, acquire nuclear weapons as soon as possible. If diplomacy wouldn't guarantee their security, maybe a bomb would.
A critical turning point, driven by perceived threats and rejected outreach. Okay, let's fast forward again. 2009. A new U.S. president, Barack Obama, comes into office wanting to engage adversaries.
Right. Obama tries a completely different approach. Just months into his term, he sends a direct video message to the Iranian people and leaders on Nowruz, the Persian New Year.
Recognizing Iran as a great civilization. That was unprecedented, wasn't it?
A first in the history of U.S.-Iran relations. Obama believed in multilateralism in diplomacy. His goal was twofold: prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but also, crucially, prevent Israel from launching a military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities.
But he kept the military option open.
Always. The phrase was, all options are on the table. Diplomacy backed by the credible threat of force.
Meanwhile, back in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu returns as prime minister, and he's less than enthusiastic about Obama's diplomacy.
Deeply skeptical. Netanyahu, a conservative Zionist, basically didn't trust that Obama would actually use force if needed. He declared Israel might have to act alone to destroy Iran's enrichment sites without Washington's consent.
Saying Israel would not delegate responsibility to anyone else. Strong words.
Very strong. It created huge tension with the Obama administration.
Was this just Netanyahu's view, or was there a consensus in Israel for a unilateral strike?
Oh, there was a massive internal debate in Israel. It wasn't just Netanyahu and his defense minister Ehud Barak pushing for it. Many top figures in the military and intelligence community were strongly opposed.
Why? What were their arguments against striking?
Several key points. 1, acting without American consensus would be incredibly risky politically and diplomatically. 2, they weren't convinced a strike could completely eliminate the program, just delay it. And 3, the big one: it could backfire, provoke a massive regional war, or even hasten something over which you have no control, like Iran deciding to definitely race for a bomb afterwards.
So facing that internal opposition, Netanyahu and Barak ultimately had to back down.
They were essentially outnumbered within their own security establishment. They couldn't get the consensus needed for such a momentous action.
Which then clears the path for Obama's diplomatic track.
Exactly. With the immediate threat of an Israeli strike receding, Obama felt he had the space to pursue direct negotiations with Iran. These started in utmost secrecy in late 2012 in Oman.
But Netanyahu didn't give up trying to stop a deal. His speech to the U.S. Congress in March 2015 was extraordinary.
An unprecedented move addressing Congress directly to lobby against the sitting U.S. president's foreign policy initiative. He argued passionately, this deal won't change Iran for the better, it will only change the Middle East for the worse.
But ultimately,
his maneuver proved to be futile. The momentum towards a deal was too strong among the negotiating powers, the US, UK, France, Germany, Russia, China.
And so, July 14, 2015, the deal is signed. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA.
Iran agrees to significantly limit its uranium enrichment program, accept intrusive inspections, basically ensuring it couldn't quickly build a bomb. In return, crippling international sanctions would be gradually lifted.
How was it received?
For most Iranians, our sources suggest it was a huge moment, a beacon of hope for economic recovery and ending their isolation. For Netanyahu and Israeli hardliners, though, it was seen as a disaster. They felt it legitimized the Islamic Republic, made it inescapable, and left Israel feeling more isolated than ever.
But this era of cautious optimism, this attempt at diplomatic resolution, it didn't last.
No. Just a few years later, May 2018, President Donald Trump fulfills a campaign promise and unilaterally withdraws the United States from the Iran nuclear deal.
Which plunges everything back into uncertainty and confrontation. A new phase, as the sources put it.
Absolutely. Reimposition of U.S. sanctions, Iran restarting parts of its nuclear program, the cycle of tension ramps right back up.
So when you look back over this whole period, over 40 years, It's remarkable. Full-scale declared war hasn't broken out between the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Not directly, no. But a state of war has been the norm. Proxy conflicts, assassinations, sabotage, cyber attacks, constant tension.
And almost a complete absence of real dialogue, hasn't there?
Yeah.
A failure to get past the history, the mistrust.
A deadly rationale of confrontation, as one analysis calls it. And maybe, fundamentally, a lack of respect for each other's individuality, for each other's legitimate security concerns, however different their perspectives are.
It feels like a history just littered with missed opportunities, perceptions of betrayal, actions and reactions driven by fear.
It really does. Which brings us to the final thought, the question maybe to leave listeners with.
Yeah.
If this 40-year history is defined by this cycle of mistrust and conflict, what kind of truly radical, maybe even unprecedented step could any of these players, Washington, Tehran, Tel Aviv, take to actually break that cycle, to move towards some kind of mutual recognition, maybe even a sustainable peace, instead of just perpetuating this undeclared war indefinitely?